Events are planned across the United States to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the assassination of civil rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The 39-year-old Baptist minister died in Memphis, Tennessee on this day, April the 4th, in 1968, while standing on the second-floor balcony of the Lorraine Motel when a sniper's bullet struck him in the neck, sparking rioting in more than 100 cities across the country. Our correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease looks back at that fateful day and engages both historians and political scientists about King's legacy 5 decades later.
This picture taken moments after the bullet struck Dr. King in the neck. Witnesses pointing to where they thought the shot was fired from. And while conspiracies remain about government and police involvement, drifter James Earl Ray was convicted of the crime and sentenced to 99 years in prison, where he later died.
Many people thought that Black Americans would just rip this country apart.
Christina Greer is a political scientist and the author of Black Ethnics, Race, Immigration, and the Pursuit of the American Dream.
President Kennedy has already been assassinated, so the country's already on edge, thinking about how do we treat our great leaders and what potentially could happen to them. And so I think a lot of white Americans were afraid that Black Americans would burn this country to the ground. James Brown, in a famous speech after one of his concerts, calls for calm. He doesn't want people to riot. You know, there had already been some rebellions in major cities in the months and years preceding Dr. King's death. And so I think for some white Americans, they were happy, right? Finally, it happened. And then for others, I think they worried that King's dream would die along with him.
Historian Joshua Brown points to that period as a time in America where it was risky standing up and making progressive arguments.
This was the point of no return for a lot of people who had hopes for change, and that the reactions that were already beginning against a lot of progressive change around issues of equality had already begun to take place. And I think that this was already seen as both symbolic and also indicative that you could not standing up was going to get you killed.
I feel that we can still have a nonviolent demonstration, and that we will have a nonviolent demonstration here in Memphis.
At the time of his death, King was said to be depressed, fatigued at the slow progress they were making towards social justice, while faced with the impatience of a younger generation who increasingly challenged his stance on nonviolence.
It has to be placed in the context of the fact that there had already been a number of assassinations. Of course, the assassination of John F. Kennedy and the assassination of Malcolm X, which had happened 3 years before. So there was already in the air this sort of, I guess say, trepidation around public figures. But I think that King was particularly powerful because he was right at he was sort of at the cusp, actually, I think, of losing some of his popularity or maybe singularity as a figure.
The work that the 1964 Nobel Peace Prize recipient was involved in was stressful, to say the least, in the face of hate, discrimination, and intolerance across the country. But he also began to broaden his message to demand economic and social justice, not just for Black people, but for downtrodden people everywhere.
The promises of the Great Society have been shot down on the battlefield of Vietnam.
He also came out against the Vietnam War in a speech that drew widespread condemnation from the political class at the time, while the FBI regarded him as the most dangerous man in America.
That's a dangerous message for people who are in power, who believe in capitalism, white supremacy, and anti-Black racism and patriarchy, if someone is trying to collectively gather up all of the oppressed people around the globe from country to country to say, you know what, we can actually rise up and fight for ourselves. And then you also have the King who really said, you know, I want to talk about wage equity. I want to talk about a living wage. I want to talk about not just jobs, but how do we sort of plant a foundation to have a real future, not just some pennies on the dollar. And that is really dangerous for a lot of people.
50 years later, he's among the most celebrated Americans with a national holiday in his name, and the King Memorial next to the National Mall in Washington.
Now, 50 years on, what might he say about America today?
I think that he'd be impressed with some progress. Record numbers of black electeds holding electoral office across the country. Obviously, he'd, I would assume, be impressed with the fact that this country was able to elect a black president. I think he'd be really disappointed with the amount of residential segregation that still exists, segregation within educational systems. Even when the buildings are integrated, the classrooms are segregated. I think he'd be really disappointed with the lack of wealth that's been able to stay within black communities and sort of the institutional barriers that this country has consistently put up to make sure that black Americans are still not fully incorporated as citizens.
To be completely cynical, martyrs are forever. People who get to be old and get to contradict everything that they had, that they had stand for before, is problematic. If anything, one of the things that he was beginning to talk about, even in his last writings, was the realization that the tactics had to change, that in many ways African Americans would need to confront the necessity to create political blocs in one way or another, that there was going to have to be a much more practical politics to be involved here. Now, that might have taken away his stature. On the other hand, he might have ended up being quite effective.
The project of racial and economic equity still very much a work in progress. Sherwin, Bryce-Pease, SABC News, New York.